Part 2. As they listened, neither Ambrose nor Jane noticed the small shadow lurking outside the door. Evelyn, still in her silk pajamas, peered through the crack, her dark eyes glinting with malice. Silent as a ghost, she retreated, a smile playing on her lips as she hurried down the corridor. "They plan to do it tomorrow night," Jane continued, turning off the recording and stuffing the phone back into her pocket. "During the special dinner Senora Sabrina is organizing. Don Ambrose, they also have plans for your mother. They want to send her away to a terrible place, where no one will hear her cries." Tears streamed down Jane's face as she spoke, her hands shaking so much that Ambrose reached out to steady them. The weight of her words crushed him. He sank into his leather chair, burying his face in his hands. 2 decades of marriage, decades of friendship with Graham. It had all been a mirage, a macabre play with his life as the final act. "My mother's medicine," he muttered, the realization hitting him like a thunderbolt. "Sabrina insists on giving it to her herself. She always says Jane is too busy to handle it." He looked up, his eyes wide with terror. What has she been giving her? Before Jane could respond, another sound from the hallway startled them, a louder noise this time. Ambrose quickly stashed the incriminating documents back into the desk drawer. His mind raced, formulating a plan as the seconds ticked away. "Jane," he whispered, his voice steady despite his panic, "do not leave my mother alone with Sabrina, not for a single moment. Tomorrow, we will act before dinner. Whatever it takes." The sharp, rhythmic sound of high heels echoed closer. Sabrina was coming. Jane's eyes widened with panic, but Ambrose motioned toward a side door. "Go now," he urged, his tone firm, "and be careful." Jane slipped into the side corridor, disappearing into the shadows just as Evelyn reached her parents' bedroom. "Mommy," the child called, her voice a mix of urgency and satisfaction. "Daddy is in the office with Jane." They were listening to something on her phone. Sabrina, seated at her vanity, adjusting her diamond earrings, paused. Her reflection in the mirror showed a smile slowly spreading across her face, a predatory, calculating grin. "Very good, my dear," she murmured, rising gracefully. "Let us see what your father is up to." The Whitmore Mansion's library, once a refuge of peace, now carried a somber weight. The towering mahogany shelves, lined with leather-bound volumes, gleamed in the filtered morning sunlight. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper, wood polish, and fresh flowers from a porcelain vase on a side table. Marian sat in her favorite armchair, a deep blue velvet seat that had cradled her during countless hours of reading. Now, her trembling hands turned the yellowed pages of an old photo album, each image a window to happier times. Her thin fingers traced the photographs: Ambrose's graduation, her wedding with Fernando, the family's first trips. They felt like fragments of a life that was slipping further away with each breath. At the doorway, Ambrose stood silently, his heart aching at the sight of his mother. The once indomitable matriarch, the pillar of the family, now appeared frail and broken. Her shoulders hunched, her face aged, and her eyes, once bright with wisdom, now filled with fear. "Mom," Ambrose called softly, his voice hesitant, not wanting to startle her. Even so, Marian flinched, her wide eyes filled with terror before recognizing her son. That reaction cut Ambrose deeply, a reminder of how far things had fallen. He moved closer, lowering himself onto the stool at her feet, a gesture he hadn't made since childhood, when he'd sit there to hear her stories. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice low and trembling with emotion. He took her hands in his, feeling the fragility in her bones, the thinness of her skin. Tears streamed silently down Marianne's cheeks as she struggled to speak. Finally, she whispered, her voice broken. She said, "No one would believe me. I would be institutionalized," Marianne whispered, her voice barely audible over the ticking clock. "You would never believe me, not against your perfect wife." Her voice faltered, swallowed by tears as she buried her face in her trembling hands, despair washing over her like a tide. Decades of dignity had been eroded, leaving only the constant struggle to survive in the face of unrelenting fear. Ambrose held his mother's hands tightly, his firm grip a stark contrast to the gentleness in his expression. "Tell me everything, Mom," he urged, his voice resolute yet tender. "Every detail, every threat, every moment of fear you endured while I was blind to what was happening in this house." For the first time in years, Mary Ann felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, she wasn't alone anymore. The words poured out of her like water from a shattered dam. She spoke of the daily humiliations she suffered at Sabrina's hands, the constant threats to send her to a nursing home, the medications forced upon her. Her voice trembled as she recounted how Sabrina manipulated Evelyn, twisting her granddaughter into a reflection of her own cruelty. "She's teaching the girl horrible things, Ambrose," Marian said, her voice breaking. "Things a child should never learn." Her hands tightened on his with surprising strength. "She said she knows places, terrible places, nursing homes where people disappear, where no one hears the screams." Each revelation was like a blow to Ambrose, his anger growing with every confession. When Mary Ann mentioned Graham, his closest friend, he closed his eyes, fighting to suppress the whirlwind of emotions threatening to consume him. "I know, Mom," he finally said, his voice heavy with grief and fury. "I know about them, about the plan, about everything." He paused, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The dinner tonight they planned? But the words caught in his throat. How could he tell his mother that her daughter-in-law intended to end her life? The faint sound of fabric brushing against would snap them both out of their thoughts. Marian froze, her breath caught in her chest. Ambrose turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Sabrina, partially hidden behind a bookshelf. Her navy blue dress was slightly disheveled, a subtle clue that she had been there long enough to hear more than she should have. For the first time, Sabrina's composed mask slipped. Her face, always a portrait of control, showed a crack, an unfamiliar flicker of uncertainty. Mary Ann shrank into the armchair, her eyes wide with terror, as if wishing to disappear. But Ambrose didn't move. His gaze locked onto Sabrina's, unyielding and cold. "Dear," Sabrina began, her voice laced with forced sweetness, "your mother has been so confused lately. You know how she's been imagining things." Her words faltered as she met Ambrose's hardened stare. For the first time in 20 years, Sabrina Whitmore felt the icy grip of fear. The tension broke with the sound of light footsteps in the hallway. Evelyn appeared at the library door, dressed in a delicate white lace dress, her dark curls tied back with a ribbon. Her sharp eyes took in the scene with an unsettling curiosity that seemed far beyond her years. "Mommy," she called, her voice sweet but tinged with a familiar malice. "Uncle Graham is on the phone. He said it's about the special dinner tonight." Ambrose rose slowly, placing himself between his mother and Sabrina like a protective barrier. His stance was firm, unyielding. "Yes," he said, his voice grave, the weight of his words deliberate. His eyes never left Sabrina's. "We're going to have a very special night, aren't we, dear?" The afternoon sun cast long, fragmented shadows through the stained glass windows of the Whitmore Mansion's office. Ambrose, hidden in the cramped storage room adjacent to the office, stood motionless, his body tense as he peered through a narrow crack in the wooden wall. His view was limited but enough to see Sabrina and Graham enter the room, their figures illuminated by the golden light spilling through the stained glass. Ambrose's phone lay hidden under a pile of documents on the desk, its recording function capturing every word of the damning conversation. The air in the storage room was stifling, heavy with the scent of old wood, ink, and the distant aroma of cognac. But the tension in Ambrose's chest outweighed the oppressive atmosphere, his heartbeat thundering in his ears as he listened intently. Sabrina entered first, her movements poised and deliberate. The red dress she wore clung to her like a second skin, her high heels marking a steady rhythm against the wooden floor. Her dark hair, sleek and immaculate, framed her face like a crown, though her eyes betrayed the malice beneath her polished exterior. Graham followed, his usual air of sophistication now sickening to Ambrose. The tailored Italian suit, the gold watch, once a gift from Ambrose himself, all felt like mocking reminders of the betrayal unfolding before him. Graham carried a leather briefcase containing the company's most important documents, its presence a cruel twist to Ambrose's growing realization. "The old doctor called this morning," Sabrina said, pouring herself a glass of cognac. Her voice was calm, but the satisfaction in her tone made Ambrose's skin crawl. "He's agreed to certify your mother's dementia. Within a week, she'll be committed." She sipped the amber liquid, her smile reflected in the crystal glass. "He knows a perfect place, far from here. No one will ask questions if a patient disappears." Ambrose's stomach churned as he listened. Every word felt like a dagger, twisting deeper into the core of everything he thought he knew. His fingers dug into his palms, his rage threatening to boil over. "Is the documentation ready?" Graham asked, his voice tight, the veneer of calm cracking slightly. "All prepared," Sabrina replied, placing a hand on Graham's shoulder. "The medical reports, testimonies from the staff, even that idiot Jane. She'll do whatever it takes to protect her pathetic little family." Her crystalline laugh echoed through the room, sharp and discordant. In the storage room, Ambrose's jaw clenched, his nails biting into his skin as he fought to stay silent. "And Ambrose?" Graham asked, his tone betraying a flicker of concern. "He's been different lately, more observant. Do you think he suspects?" Sabrina smiled, a chilling expression that made Ambrose's blood run cold. "I have something special planned for him," she said, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "That poison we got? It's perfect, undetectable, fast, and mimics a heart attack beautifully." The sound of light footsteps outside the office made everyone pause. In the storage room, Ambrose held his breath, his heart pounding. Through the crack, he saw Evelyn appear in the doorway, her favorite doll clutched in one hand. "Darling," Sabrina cooed, her voice suddenly syrupy, "come here. Uncle Graham and I are planning a very special surprise for Daddy." Evelyn approached, her small frame exuding an unsettling grace. "Is it about tonight's dinner, Mommy?" she asked, her childlike voice laced with malice. "The one that will make Daddy sleep forever?" The pride on Sabrina's face as she heard Evelyn's words was grotesque. "Exactly, my love," she said, crouching to caress her daughter's dark curls. "And then, when Grandma goes to that special place, it will be just the three of us, you, me, and Uncle Graham." Her gaze shifted to Graham, whose responding smile wavered, a flicker of tension breaking through his usual composure. In the storage room, Ambrose glanced at his phone, double-checking that the recording was still capturing every word. The anger that had once consumed him had cooled, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. The man who crouched in the shadows was no longer the naive husband who had once trusted his wife and friend implicitly. That part of him had died, replaced by a relentless determination to expose the truth. Graham checked his gold watch, the one Ambrose had gifted him in what now felt like another life. Rising, he finished his drink in a single gulp. "I need to go," he said. "The bank transfer documents need to be finalized. After everything happens, we'll need to move fast." He leaned in to kiss Sabrina, a gesture that felt like a profanation in the space where so many cherished family memories had been forged. "Don't worry," Sabrina replied, her smile taking on a sadistic edge. "In 24 hours, Ambrose will be gone, the old woman institutionalized, and we'll be free and rich." She raised her glass in a mock toast, the amber liquid gleaming in the dim light. It was a toast to the destruction of the Whitmore family. Night fell over the Whitmore mansion like a suffocating shroud, the silence thick and oppressive. Ambrose parked his car 2 blocks away, cutting the engine and sitting motionless for a moment. The phone in his pocket, loaded with the damning recordings, felt like a brand against his skin, a constant reminder of the gravity of what was about to transpire. Tonight would mark a point of no return. He walked along the quiet streets leading to the mansion, the scent of jasmine from a neighbor's garden carried on the cool night breeze. It was an almost mocking contrast to the chaos consuming his thoughts. Reaching the mansion, he paused, gazing at its familiar facade. The lights upstairs cast distorted shadows through the windows. His attention lingered on the master bedroom, where Sabrina's silhouette moved with her characteristic feline grace. What had once been enchanting now felt ominous, a predator prowling her domain. Entering through the back door with the key he always carried, Ambrose was greeted by the familiar scent of the house. Wood polish, traces of Jane's perfume, and an indefinable undertone that seemed new. He moved through the silent corridors, his steps muffled against the worn carpet. The family portraits on the walls seemed to watch him, their frozen expressions heavy with judgment. Each image of his wedding, each photograph of moments once cherished, now felt like mocking reminders of Sabrina's carefully constructed charade. He had barely taken a few steps when Sabrina's voice drifted down from the upstairs hallway. Clear, controlled, and laced with chilling intent, it made his heart pound. He moved silently toward the staircase, his body tense, his muscles coiled like springs. "Yes, everything is prepared," Sabrina was saying. Her melodious voice, once a source of comfort, now felt sinister. "I've already put the poison in his glass. In a day, he'll be dead. The doctor assured me it will look like a heart attack." She laughed, a soft, crystalline sound that sliced through the silence like shattering glass. "No, dear, no one will suspect. Poor Ambrose, so stressed from work." Ambrose felt his legs weaken, his grip tightening on the railing. Suspicion was one thing. Hearing his wife confess to his murder was another. 20 years of marriage, built on trust, had been reduced to a casual death sentence delivered with cruel detachment. "The special glass is already set aside," Sabrina continued, her voice taking on an intimate tone. "The one with the gold details, his favorite. One last gift for my beloved husband." Her words dripped with sarcasm, each syllable a knife twisting in Ambrose's heart. He vividly remembered the day she had gifted him that goblet, insisting he use it for every special occasion. Now, that moment of supposed affection was revealed as part of her plan. The weight of irony was crushing. "And then, my love," Sabrina purred, "we'll be free, rich, finally together." Ambrose's fists clenched, the veins in his temples throbbing. His mind raced as her words cut through him. He had to act, but he couldn't afford a misstep. Then he heard it, the soft patter of footsteps in the hallway. He froze, fearing his presence had been discovered, but the steps came from the opposite direction. Turning, he saw Evelyn at the end of the hallway, dressed in a flowing white silk nightgown. The dim light gave her an ethereal quality, but her eyes, the cruel glint in her eyes, belied her appearance. "Daddy!" Evelyn's voice cut through the silence like a blade. It was sweet, but carried an undercurrent of alarm that sent a chill down Ambrose's spine. Upstairs, Sabrina's voice stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own heartbeat. The rustle of Evelyn's gown against the marble floor grew louder as she approached. "Darling," Sabrina called from the top of the stairs, her voice forced into a maternal tone but cracking slightly under tension. "What is it? Who are you talking to?" The rhythmic strike of her heels on the marble steps echoed like a countdown. Ambrose's eyes met Evelyn's as she tilted her head, her expression unreadable. He searched for a glimmer of the innocence he had once cherished in his daughter, but saw only a calculated satisfaction. "Mom," Evelyn called, her voice carrying a hint of malice. "I think Daddy came home early for his surprise." The Whitmore Mansion's dining room was a spectacle of opulence. The massive baccarat crystal chandelier bathed the room in warm light, its brilliance reflected in the polished silver candelabras and the gilt-edged French porcelain on the table. Arrangements of deep red roses, Sabrina's favorite, lined the center of the table, their heady fragrance mingling with the aroma of the evening's meal. Ambrose entered the room slowly, his gaze sweeping over the scene. Every detail was meticulous, each napkin fold, each glint of silver, a testament to Sabrina's obsessive control. But he knew this was more than a dinner. It was the stage for her final act. Sabrina stood near the table, overseeing the final adjustments with an effortless grace that belied the darkness within. Her black dress hugged her figure like a second skin, her hair styled into a chic updo that highlighted her slender neck. She moved with precision, her manicured fingers lightly brushing the rims of the crystal goblets. Ambrose's attention fixed on the gilded goblet placed carefully at his seat. Sabrina adjusted its position with a deliberate touch, the glint in her eyes a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. Jane entered, supporting Marianne, who looked frilier than ever. The matriarch's pallor and unsteady steps betrayed the toll of the day's revelations. Despite her struggles, she carried herself with quiet dignity, though Ambrose could see the shadow of fear in her eyes. Sabrina turned toward them, her smile bright and practiced. "Mother," she said warmly, her voice dripping with false affection. She moved to Marianne's side, her role as the devoted daughter-in-law perfectly rehearsed. "I'm so glad you could join us," Sabrina exclaimed, her voice dripping with rehearsed sweetness. Her smile appeared warm and welcoming, but Ambrose saw through the facade. "This dinner wouldn't be the same without you." Marianne forced a weak smile as she lowered herself into her chair, struggling with every movement. Jane adjusted the seat for her with trembling hands, the housekeeper's fear barely masked under Sabrina's piercing gaze. As she fussed with Marianne's napkin, Jane exchanged a fleeting look with Ambrose, a look that spoke volumes. She knew the storm that was about to unfold. Graham entered next, his arrival announced by the faint woodsy scent of his cologne. He was impeccable, as always, his charcoal gray suit tailored to perfection. His demeanor exuded confidence and control as he strode into the room with open arms. "Ambrose, my friend," he declared, embracing him with exaggerated enthusiasm. "What a special night, eh?" Ambrose returned the embrace stiffly, his face unreadable. "The night promises to be unforgettable," he replied, his tone even but weighted with subtext. He watched as Graham settled into the chair beside Sabrina, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. It was subtle, but the conspiratorial glance they exchanged spoke volumes. It was a fleeting display of intimacy that did not escape Ambrose's notice. Evelyn was the last to enter, her party dress making her look like a porcelain doll. Her raven curls bounced as she skipped to her chair, her wide eyes shimmering with a mix of excitement and something darker. "Daddy," she chirped, her voice sweet, though Ambrose detected the malicious undertone she had inherited from her mother. "Mommy said tonight is going to be unforgettable." Her words, innocent on the surface, felt like a warning. As the meal progressed, Ambrose kept up the pretense of casual conversation with Graham, their dialogue focused on business and recent company decisions. Yet every word was laced with hidden meanings. Ambrose's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, the presence of his best friend, now revealed as a co-conspirator, both enraging and sharpening his focus. Jane served the red wine, her hands trembling slightly as she poured the hand-picked Cabernet Sauvignon. Her eyes met Ambrose's briefly, and he gave her a barely perceptible nod. It was a silent acknowledgement that they were playing the same dangerous game. When Jane left the room, Ambrose seized his chance. Pretending to drop his napkin, he bent down, his movements quick and discreet. With practiced precision, he swapped the golden goblet meant for him with Sabrina's. Rising smoothly, he locked eyes with his wife, who was watching him with an enigmatic smile. Sabrina stood gracefully, the shimmering fabric of her black dress catching the chandelier's light. She raised the goblet, the same one Ambrose had just switched, with theatrical flair. The golden crystal sparkled under the room's warm glow, a deadly jewel hiding its purpose. "Dear ones," she began, her voice as melodic as ever, laced with a sweetness that now felt sickening to Ambrose. "I'd like to make a very special toast tonight." Her eyes met his, gleaming with malice that only he could recognize. "To my beloved husband, the most wonderful man in the world." Ambrose maintained his composure, raising his glass to meet hers. His expression remained neutral, though inside, his anticipation was palpable. "These 20 years with you have been like a dream," Sabrina continued, her voice trembling with feigned emotion. "You've given me everything, a life of luxury, a wonderful daughter, a family." She turned her gaze to Marianne, her smile saccharine, "and a mother-in-law who is like a true mother to me." Ambrose noticed her fingers caressing the rim of the goblet, the motion disturbingly intimate. "So, raise your glasses," she said, her voice reaching a crescendo. "To my Ambrose, to our eternal love, to a night that will truly mark the beginning of a new phase in our lives." Ambrose lifted his glass, his gaze fixed on Sabrina's, a quiet storm brewing in his green eyes. "To our family," he echoed, his voice calm but loaded with an irony she couldn't yet grasp. Sabrina brought the glass to her lips, sipping slowly. The room seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Sabrina blinked, her hand rising to her throat as her eyes widened in realization. The golden goblet slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor with a sound that echoed like thunder. "Mommy!" Evelyn's voice rang out, this time carrying genuine fear. The girl shot out of her chair, running to her mother as Sabrina staggered backward. Her face had turned ashen, her eyes losing their usual gleam. What did you do?" Sabrina gasped, her voice weak and trembling. Her gaze locked on Ambrose, a mixture of horror and fury in her expression. Graham leapt to his feet, his chair clattering to the floor. He rushed to support Sabrina, his usual composure shattered. But Ambrose remained seated, his relaxed posture a chilling contrast to the chaos unfolding around him. "I merely swapped the glasses, my dear," Ambrose said softly. His voice was gentle, almost tender, but carried an unmistakable edge that sent shivers through everyone present. "As you were making your beautiful speech about love and trust, I thought about how meticulous you've always been with your plans." He swirled his wine slowly, watching the liquid swirl against the crystal. "It's a shame, really. You missed one crucial detail tonight." He set the glass down carefully, his movements deliberate, before rising to his feet. Sabrina clutched at the table for support, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her carefully curated persona was crumbling before their eyes. "You were right about one thing," Ambrose continued, his voice calm and deadly. "Tonight does mark the beginning of a new phase in our lives, though perhaps not as you intended." He raised his glass one final time, a cold smile playing on his lips. "To our eternal love." Sabrina's legs buckled, and she collapsed, Graham shouting for help as chaos erupted in the room. Hours later, the sterile corridors of San Angel Hospital were quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors. The fluorescent lighting reflected harshly off the polished floors, contrasting starkly with the darkness of Ambrose's thoughts. He stood by a window overlooking the hospital courtyard, his tailored gray suit impeccable despite the exhaustion etched into his face. The sound of hurried footsteps drew his attention. Turning slowly, he saw Graham approaching. His once pristine suit was rumpled, and beads of sweat glistened on his forehead. "How is she?" Graham asked, his tone attempting casualness but betraying his nervousness. His hands fidgeted, adjusting his tie compulsively. Ambrose regarded him coldly, letting the silence stretch. "The doctor says she'll survive," he replied finally, his voice firm and deliberate, though perhaps with consequences. "The poison you selected is quite effective at causing neurological damage." Graham's face paled. His hands dropped to his sides, the color draining from his usually confident demeanor. "Ambrose, I can explain." "Spare me." Ambrose cut him off, his tone icy. Taking a step closer, he loomed over Graham, his presence radiating restrained fury. "You and Sabrina thought you could play me for a fool," he said, his voice low and deadly. "But the game has changed. And now, Graham, it's my move." "Daddy," Evelyn called softly, still nestled in her grandmother's embrace, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "Do you think one day Mommy will be okay again?" Ambrose paused mid-sip of his coffee, his hand lowering the cup slowly to the table. The room grew still, the question lingering like a fragile thread connecting the past and the present. Beatrice's hand gently stroked Evelyn's hair, her gaze shifting to Ambrose, waiting for his response. Ambrose exhaled deeply, placing his cup down with deliberate care. His green eyes, weary but steady, met his daughter's. "I don't know, sweetheart," he replied honestly, his tone gentle but firm. "Sometimes, people make choices that hurt others, and it takes a long time, if ever, for them to see the harm they've done." Evelyn's small face crumpled with sadness, her tears spilling anew. "But what if she says she's sorry? What if she wants to come back?" Ambrose rose from his chair, kneeling beside his daughter to meet her at eye level. His hands gently rested on her small shoulders. "Evelyn, forgiveness is important, and we can hope that one day your mom understands what she's done. But right now, what matters most is that we take care of each other. You, me, Grandma, and Nora. We're a family, and we'll heal together." Evelyn nodded slowly, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Her gaze shifted to Beatrice, who smiled warmly and hugged her tighter, whispering softly, "We're here for you, my love." The Whitmore mansion, once a grand but stifling monument to control and deceit, now felt lighter, as if it too was healing. The changes Ambrose had encouraged, light curtains, fresh flowers, and more open spaces, symbolized a transformation. The air carried a newfound warmth, a blend of renewal and resilience. Jane, no longer clad in her stiff gray uniform, moved gracefully around the breakfast room, her attire now reflecting her new role as a member of the family rather than just an employee. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her movements infused with purpose rather than fear. The subtle scent of freshly brewed coffee and cinnamon rolls filled the room, mingling with the soft hum of morning conversation. Beatrice, seated by the sunlit window, had regained much of the poise she had once lost. The light blue silk ensemble she wore complemented the serene expression on her face. The lines on her face, once etched with worry, now carried a quiet dignity. Her hands, no longer trembling, lifted her coffee cup with steady grace. As Ambrose settled back into his seat, Jane approached with the silver coffee pitcher, her warm smile a reflection of the peace that had begun to settle over the household. "More coffee, Mr. Ambrose?" she asked. "Please," Ambrose replied, returning her smile. He gestured toward Evelyn, who was nibbling on a cinnamon roll. "And keep an eye on her. She'll eat every last one if you're not careful." Evelyn giggled, her laughter light and genuine, a sound that had been absent for far too long. "I didn't eat half last time," she protested, her cheeks puffing slightly as she grinned. Beatrice reached out, placing a gentle hand on Evelyn's. "You're growing up too fast, my dear," she said softly. Her voice was warm, filled with the kind of love that had been buried beneath Sabrina's cruelty for so long. Evelyn glanced at her grandmother, her face suddenly serious. "Grandma," she said hesitantly, "do you forgive me? Mommy, she taught me bad things. She made me say and do mean things. I didn't mean it." Her voice cracked, and tears welled up in her eyes as genuine remorse spilled out. Jane, watching from the corner of the room, instinctively placed a hand over her heart, as if absorbing the weight of the child's pain. Beatrice didn't hesitate. She opened her arms, pulling Evelyn into a firm embrace. "My love," she whispered, her voice steady and full of reassurance, "you are just a child. Children learn. The important thing is that you're here with us now, and you're learning what's right. Together, with your father and Nora, we'll overcome everything." Ambrose watched the scene with a heavy but hopeful heart. The scars left by Sabrina's actions might never fully fade, but he could see the possibility of healing in his daughter's tearful smile, in his mother's renewed strength, and in the quiet resilience of their home. Though Sabrina was no longer physically present, her absence loomed over the mansion like a lingering shadow. The divorce proceedings were ongoing, and each court date brought fresh reminders of the damage she had wrought. The sparse updates from the psychiatric hospital painted a bleak picture. Sabrina was a shell of her former self, her once razor-sharp mind dulled by the very poison she had intended for Ambrose. Ambrose carried the weight of these events, but he also carried the knowledge that he had protected his family from further harm. Standing at the window after breakfast, he watched the sun climb higher in the sky, illuminating the gardens where Evelyn played with her doll. His thoughts drifted to the future, a future he knew would require patience, understanding, and strength. Jane approached quietly, carrying a small vase filled with freshly picked flowers. "The house feels different," she said, breaking the silence. "Lighter." Ambrose nodded, his gaze never leaving Evelyn. "It does," he agreed, "and it will keep getting better." Evelyn's question hung in the air like the faint echo of all she had endured. "Will I ever be able to forget all this?" Her voice was soft, but the weight of her lost innocence was unmistakable. Ambrose knelt beside her, placing his hands gently on her small shoulders. "The important thing, my little one, isn't to forget," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's to remember, so we can grow and become better. Look out at the garden. See the flowers Nora is tending? Sometimes, we have to prune away the things that aren't good so that something new and beautiful can bloom." Nora, who had been quietly observing, began humming an old Mexican lullaby as she moved about the room, her voice soft and soothing. The melody wrapped itself around the space like a protective charm, dispelling the lingering shadows that still clung to the mansion. Beatrice turned to Nora, her smile warm and genuine. "Nora," she said suddenly, extending her hand, "you're part of this family now. I don't want you to serve us. I want you to join us." The unexpected gesture brought tears to Nora's eyes. She hesitated for only a moment before taking Beatrice's hand and sitting down at the table, her blue skirt rustling softly as she adjusted it. Light conversation and laughter resumed, each small sound feeling like a hard-won victory against the past. The Lockwoods were finding their rhythm, a new harmony that offered hope for the future. Suddenly, Evelyn jumped from her seat and darted up the stairs, leaving everyone momentarily bewildered. She returned moments later, clutching an old family portrait. It was one Sabrina had proudly displayed, a photo where everyone smiled, a happiness that now felt like a lie. "Can we take a new picture?" Evelyn asked, her voice filled with hope. "A real one this time, with Nora too." The request carried a profound weight, a child's desire to rewrite history, to replace falsehoods with something true. Ambrose swallowed the lump rising in his throat and nodded. "Yes, my love," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "We'll take a new picture, one that shows who we are now." On the other side of the city, far from the renewed warmth of the Lockwood mansion, Sabrina sat alone in her dim, claustrophobic room at the San Francisco de Assis Asylum. The faded gray walls, marred by cracks and stains, seemed to mock her once glamorous life. Her narrow bed, its thin mattress uneven and covered with a scratchy sheet, felt worlds away from the luxury she had once demanded. Sabrina's reflection in the room's small, rusted mirror tormented her daily. Her face, once radiant and commanding, now bore the marks of her own cruelty. The left side remained paralyzed, twisting her expression into a permanent grimace, a cruel caricature of the woman she had been. Her once pristine hair was streaked with gray, falling limply around her shoulders. The poison she had prepared for Ambrose had left its scars, physical and otherwise. That morning, a nurse brought her 2 letters. Sabrina's trembling hands opened the first envelope, instantly recognizing the crest of Ambrose's law firm. It was the divorce papers. As her eyes scanned the terms, her stomach dropped. She had been left with nothing. No jewelry, no summer house, no allowance. The final blow was a handwritten note from Ambrose at the bottom of the document. "Consider yourself lucky you're not in jail." The second envelope was smaller, but no less cruel. Sabrina's breath hitched as she saw Graham's handwriting. The note inside was short, blunt, and devastating. "I'm sorry, but I can't risk my future for you. Ambrose gave me a choice, and I chose my freedom. Everything we had, every plan we made, it meant nothing compared to my survival. When you read this, I'll already be far from here. Don't try to find me. You don't have the power or connections anymore. Life's irony, isn't it? You once despised those beneath you, and now you're worse off than any of them. Goodbye, Sabrina." The words stung like acid, burning through the last shreds of her pride. Her hands trembled as the letter slipped from her grasp. From her barred window, she could hear children playing in the courtyard below. Their laughter should have been joyful, but to Sabrina, it was a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. Her thoughts drifted to Evelyn, her daughter, her perfect pawn. She remembered their last meeting at the hospital, Evelyn's small hand tightly gripping Beatrice's. "You're not my mother anymore," Evelyn had said, her voice trembling but resolute. "You just used me. You turned me into a monster, like you. Grandma says I shouldn't take pleasure in other people's suffering, but—" Evelyn hesitated, her young face hardening with a maturity beyond her years. "Seeing you like this feels deserved." The memory cut deeper than Sabrina could bear. Tears streamed down the functional side of her face as the echoes of her daughter's words reverberated in her mind. Back at the Lockwood mansion, the family gathered for dinner. Laughter and genuine conversation filled the once oppressive space. Evelyn, now free to be a child, giggled openly as Beatrice recounted stories from Ambrose's childhood. Nora shared tales of her own life, her voice animated and warm. Her family had moved into the East Wing, their presence transforming the mansion from a symbol of fear into a true home. Ambrose observed it all with quiet satisfaction. The scars left by Sabrina and Graham would take time to heal, but the family was rebuilding itself on a foundation of love and trust. Evelyn, especially, was blossoming. Her dark eyes no longer shadowed by malice, but lit with the innocence of an 8-year-old discovering her world anew. In the asylum, night descended. Sabrina sat alone, staring at the faint reflection in her window, the iron bars casting harsh shadows across her disfigured face. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of laughter and music from the courtyard below. Her empire of lies had crumbled, leaving her a prisoner not just of the asylum, but of her own regrets. Every humiliation she had inflicted, every calculated cruelty, played in her mind like a relentless film reel. For Sabrina, justice had come not in a courtroom, but in the cold, unrelenting mirror of her own downfall. Meanwhile, at the mansion, life continued. The family took their new photo, their smiles genuine, their bonds real. And as the sun set over the city, painting the sky in fiery hues, it marked not just the end of one chapter, but the beginning of a brighter, truer one. Justice had done its work, leaving the Whitmore family with hope and Sabrina with the bitter taste of her own poison.